Welcome back, Hnrs. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the rise of the early Middle Ages, right? We left off in class talking about the early Middle Ages, right? We delineated between the Middle Age time periods, so it's about the early Middle Ages, kind of briefly described them, high Middle Ages, briefly described them, in the late Middle Ages, briefly described them. Now we're diving deep into each of these time periods, starting off with the early one, the one that we know, of course, the least about, which is really, really frustrating, but we talked about this in class, and we discussed how literally it's kind of hard to know much about anything when only 2% of people could read and nobody wrote anything down. So going into it, though, we did start talking quite a bit about how the early Middle Ages is going to be characterized by Europe being settled by the barbarians, right? The barbarian tribes that actually were living inside of Europe underneath the rulership of Rome are going to begin to disperse and settle in the areas that formerly belonged to the Roman Empire before its fall, right? And we talked about a bunch of different types of them. We discussed the Goths and the Huns and the Celts and the Saxons and the Franks and the Vandals and the Turks. We talked about all these different groups, right? Kind of briefly discussed where they were going. And like I said, the Visigoths head to Spain. The Ostrogoths settled Italy. Of course, like the Celts are going to go up towards northern Europe. They're going to head towards Scotland and Ireland, right? The Saxons and the Angles are going to be in England. The Franks are going to be in France. And the Vandals just broke a bunch of stuff and then headed towards Switzerland. Now, going into it, though, something we need to understand is that we are now going to start seeing the rise of barbarian leaders, right? So this short flip is going to be mostly about three, particular barbarian leaders that are going to formalize themselves as what you would refer to as a king, right? Like, so now going into it, though, once Rome falls, we are going to see barbarian society begin to formalize itself, right? They're going to start out in huts, just like the Romans did, and eventually grow into more complex architecture, complex governmental societies, complex economies, and things like that, just like any civilization typically does, right? They're going to begin to grow. And barbarians began to create governments and societies based on what they learned from the Romans, right? They didn't really necessarily use their philosophies and their histories and things like that. They're instead going to center themselves around different things like religion and different societal aspects that they share in common and things like that, right? But they also are going to learn from the Romans the use of their language, right? And it's why Latin is actually going to eke its way into most of the languages that you see in Europe, right? English, for example, the language of which I am speaking right now, is half Latin, half German, right? So going into it, though, you understand that they're going to begin to kind of sophisticate themselves, right? And the first kingdom that pops up following the fall of Rome is going to be this thing known as the Frankish kingdom, right? The Frankish kingdom is going to be the very first large area of land during the early Middle Ages that will formalize itself as basically a governmental body or a kingdom after the fall of Rome, right? Now, the Frankish kingdom, of course, is going to start out very, very small, right? It's going to start out as just this area right here, and then it's going to continue to grow, as you can see, as the years progress, and keep adding and adding to its borders, as one particular leader came along, centralized all the Frankish barbarians together, and began to conquer some stuff, right? And it was all started by one family, and that family was known as the Merovingian Dynasty, right? And they actually set up shop in this area, very close to where modern-day Paris is, and they actually are going to begin to expand based on a hereditary line of rulers. All started off by this guy, Clovis I, all right, who was the very first king of the Merovingians, right? Now, the Merovingian being his dynastic name is his last name, right? And he is going to rule from 481 to 511, right? Now, he was actually born even before the fall of Rome occurred, right? So he actually himself would have been around to see Rome at its empiric state, right? We actually there are some theories and stuff like that he actually had some Roman influence, right? Because he was born in 466, and his dad might have actually been a Roman general and stuff like that, and he actually might have come from basically a Roman educated background and stuff like that, so he may have actually been around some of the Romans before they even fell. But what is going to end up happening, though, is as he begins his rise to prominence and as he begins to lead a very large military, because that's what barbarian leaders do, right? They recruit a large military, and they, of course, give wealthier people underneath them certain privileges and stuff, just like every other society in history has ever done, and he's going to begin to conquer and spread his territory. Now, in this process, though, he is going to get married, right? And he marries a devout Christian woman, and he actually will eventually convert himself, right? He actually will convert to Christianity as well, which will help spread the Christian faith at an incremental rate, right? Whenever he converted to Christianity, he's then going to pass sweeping reforms to make the Christian religion the accepted religion within the Frankish kingdom, actually getting rid of old polytheistic barbaric religions that he himself actually believed in. Now, this right here is actually a very famous image of him being baptized as Clovis I, right? Now, funny enough, though, he didn't actually want to be Christian at first, right? He actually had a bunch of gods and goddesses, more related to what you would call the Nordic faiths and stuff like that at the time. He was really into that, but his wife was like, hey, if you convert to Christianity, you will be able to centralize power a little more efficiently, and I want you to go to heaven and stuff like that, so, you should just convert. And he was like, nope, I don't want to do that. I want to keep all my gods and stuff like that. And so his wife tried to baptize one of their sons in secret, and that child ended up getting an infection from the baptismal water and died, right? Now he was like, I'm definitely not converting now. And she was like, that one was just practice. And then she went and converted the other kid, and he almost died, right? And so he was just like, you know what? Fine, I'll convert. Hopefully it doesn't kill me, though, right? And it turns out that it didn't. It actually will be enacted as Clovis I, one of the very first Christian kings of Europe, if not the very first Christian king of Europe, right? Now, he's going to take over several neighboring states and tribes, and he's going to create the very first large civilization of Rome, and his biggest impact is going to be that consolidation of territory, the creation of the very first kingdom ever since the fall of Rome, the conversion to Christianity, right, which will help the faith spread, and then also his name, right? His name is a very, very big impact on history, and probably a lot of y'all are like, I've never heard the name Clovis before. Well, if you actually take Clovis, right, and you translate it over years and years and years from the original Frankish language as it goes into French, right? And what's going to happen is it's going to morph, right? The actual, it transmogrified itself, basically. And what ended up happening is over time, as people kept naming their children Clovis, they eventually dropped the C and they turned the V into a U, and that's why literally almost every single French king was named Louis, right? Now, Louis is actually going to be a transmorphied version of the name Clovis, right? Now, going into it, though, so we need to understand, as the Merovingian dynasty continues to roll forward, what's going to end up happening is they're not going to last for forever. As we know, dynasties don't always last for forever. Someone's going to die without any kids, and eventually somebody else is going to have to take over. And the family that takes over in their absence is known as the Carolingians, right? And the Carolingians were started by this guy named Charles the Hammer Martel, right? Now, the interesting thing that ended up happening is that Charles the Hammer Martel actually was not the king at first, right? He actually was not at all. There was a Merovingian leader in front of him, right? But he became what's known as the mayor of the palace. And basically, the mayor of the palace was just a very fancy title to refer to the highest ranking noble or lead government advisor to the kings and the Merovingians. And it actually turned out in a really weird way that the mayor of palace kind of did more and had more power than the king themselves, right? Well, Charles the Hammer Martel, though, does rise to that rank, and then he also famously does a very big deal at the Battle of Tours. He actually stops the advance of the Muslim armies, right? So something that you need to understand is that the Muslim armies and the Arabic armies, right, that were growing really, really, really fast because of the monsoon marketplace and all the money that was being made there, are actually going to cover all of North Africa, right? They're going to expand from the Middle East all the way through North Africa and eventually get up into Spain, right, which is actually an area of Europe, okay? And the Frankish kingdom is right up here, right? It's right there. And what's going to end up happening is that a battle called the Battle of Tours that actually takes place right there, Charles the Hammer Martel apparently hammered the Islamic empires back down into Spain, right, and stopped their growth into Europe. Hence why he's referred to as Charles the Hammer Martel. This is a very famous painting about, of course, the entirety of the battle itself. Notice Charles right here is actually sitting on top of his steed, holding his axe, right, going against these Muslim, and Arabic soldiers. And then also, of course, he's protecting the innocent woman right here, which is ridiculous. And then also going into it as well, notice he's standing in front of a cross, right? So, of course, it's going to set kind of a line and a division between the Christian kingdoms of Europe and the Arabic kingdoms to the south, right? So going into it, though, what's going to end up happening, though, is that Charles the Hammer Martel eventually puts his descendants in line for the kingship, and they actually start a transition from the Merovingians into the Carolingians. Well, the descendant of Charles the Hammer Martel, the very first one anyway, that's going to become the Holy Roman Emperor, is a man by the name of Charlemagne, right? Probably one of the most famous figures in Middle Ages history is, of course, Charlemagne, right? Charlemagne is a military leader, but he had a really good, with a decent education, right? He himself didn't have the best education on the planet, but he did learn throughout his existence, right? He did learn to read and write, and he didn't learn, basically he wasn't the smartest guy in the room, but he valued the concepts of an education, right? And he believed that an empire that was ran by intelligent, elite individuals is going to be one that has staying power. He's going to conquer massive amounts of territory, including some early Viking settlements and things like that, bringing the Frankish kingdom to its absolute height. Underneath Charlemagne, it gets to this size, right? Which is ridiculous because that right there is almost 25% of how large Rome was at one point. He's going to save the Pope from this other group of barbarians known as the Lombards, and what ends up happening is because he saved the Pope, he was crowned a new title. No longer just the king of the Frankish kingdoms, he would be known as the Holy Roman emperor, right? Because basically they were like, oh, you took over the area that was Rome and now you've brought it into your empire and now it's the Carolingian Empire. We will call you the Holy Roman Emperor. So the very first Holy Roman Emperor of this new Holy Roman Empire is going to be Charlemagne, right? And underneath his rulership, a big event's going to happen called the Carolingian Renaissance, right? And the Carolingian Renaissance is basically going to be a massive growth in intelligence, right? Charlemagne is going to push massive educational reforms that are going to lead to the increase in literacy from 2 to 4%. He actually was a very, very big deal about this. He himself, like I said, did not necessarily know how to read or write very well, right? And so he actually was like, I don't want any jesters at my meals, right? So as the Holy Roman Emperor, typically you would actually have a person that dances around the table and entertains you while you eat your meals, right? But he was like, no jesters. I want a man to sit over there and read to me, right? Like, so he valued the growth in education and intelligence. And he also said that if anybody's going to deal with him or if you want to be inside his government or inside his cabinet of cohorts, you better know how to read. So what you're going to see is that increase in literacy from 2 to 4%, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it's doubling the number of people that could actually read in Europe at the time, right? He's also going to have invented a very certain style of writing that we actually still use today, known as Carolingian minuscule, right? Carolingian minuscule, he is going to formalize the written codes, and so he's going to make it so not everything's written in capital or lowercase letters. He's going to make it so all proper nouns, places, and things like that will start with capital letters, right? And then minuscule will be the lowercase letters to formalize the systems of writing within the new Holy Roman Empire to help spread literacy as well. And then also he started this thing known as the Missi Dominici, which were actual government advisors that bopped around the entire empire and actually interviewed people. And they were like, hey, how are you? How's life? You dying of anything? You eaten lately? How's it going underneath the rulership of this noble? Blah, 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 blah. So like now, and this Missi Dominici is actually going to be the very first formalized census-taking bureau and also very first formalized bureaucratic government under any leader since the fall of Rome, right? So the Missi Dominici, like I said, if you want to write something down next to it, is a system of government advisors that actually interviewed people on their quality of life and also the efficiency of the empire and how it was running, right? So the splitting up of the empire, though, is also going to happen after he dies. He actually ends up giving it to his grandsons who don't agree on who gets what, and they end up dividing it up, right? And when they end up dividing it up at the partition of Verdun, the Frankish kingdom that became the Holy Roman Empire, that was this big chunk of territory, is going to get divided into several different areas, and it's going to lead to the growth of what is now modern-day France, later on the Holy Roman Empire, and then later on Italy as well, all right? So now, but going into it, that right there is all you need to know. We are finishing up with Charlemagne. You need to know Charlemagne, Charles Martel, and Clovis for your test as well. And I'll see y'all at the review tomorrow. Y'all have a good one.